Why go out for hamburgers when you have steak at home? Long before that sentence became a cultural quote, long before it was repeated as proof that loyalty could survive fame, it existed only as a quiet conclusion Paul Newman reached after years of watching people come and go, after learning that attraction was easy, but connection was rare. And before we try to understand this sentence, we need to understand the man who said it, not as a legend, but as someone shaped slowly by conversations between scenes, remarks from co-stars, and moments of doubt no camera ever recorded. Paul Leonard Newman was born on January 26, 1925, in Shaker Heights, Ohio, a calm, orderly suburb where life followed rules and emotions were expected to behave just as politely. His father, Arthur Newman, believed in discipline and responsibility. His mother, Teresa, valued beauty and culture. And in that household, Paul learned how to present himself well long before he learned how to speak openly about what he felt. Years later, Newman would say that his childhood taught him manners, but not emotional confidence, and that distinction stayed with him into adulthood. When he joined the U.S. Navy during World War II, he hoped to become a pilot, but a colorblindness test quietly ended that dream, pushing him into a support role. Newman later reflected on that moment as the first time life redirected him away from glory and toward observation, a role he would unknowingly master as an actor. After the war, Newman drifted through education and acting training, unsure whether talent alone would be enough, married young, and stepped into Hollywood carrying both ambition and uncertainty. In the early 1950s, as his career began to form, Newman found himself surrounded by men who would influence him in ways no script ever could. One of the most important was Montgomery Clift. Acting alongside Clift unsettled Newman because Clift did not perform masculinity the way Hollywood expected. He was open, emotionally exposed, almost fragile. And after one rehearsal, Newman reportedly said to a friend, "He doesn't hide anything, and somehow that makes him stronger." Clift once told Newman quietly between takes, "You don't need to protect yourself so much on screen," a remark Newman never forgot. It planted a question that followed him for years. What if real strength was not control, but honesty? Around other male co-stars, Newman felt competition. But with Clift, he felt comparison of a deeper kind, a comparison that made him question how much of his confidence was real and how much was performance. Working with Marlon Brando intensified that internal debate. Brando's raw unpredictability made Newman aware of how carefully he managed his own image. And after watching Brando improvise through a scene, Newman reportedly muttered, "He's not acting, he's just being," a realization that stayed with him. Female co-stars taught him different lessons. Newman noticed that. Many actresses were expected to adapt themselves to male leads, but the ones who left an impression were those who refused to shrink. During one early production, a female co-star corrected him bluntly during rehearsal, saying, "You're not listening, you're waiting to speak." And Newman later admitted that comment embarrassed him, but also sharpened his awareness. He began to understand that attraction came easily to him, but respect had to be earned through presence. Fame accelerated these lessons. By the mid-1950s, Newman was admired everywhere he went, and the attention fed a hunger he didn't fully understand yet. He later admitted that success didn't make him confident, it made him curious about how quickly admiration could disappear. "Applause ends," he once said, "and then you have to live with yourself." It was during this period, on Broadway while performing in Picnic, that Newman met Joanne Woodward. Their first exchanges were understated. She watched him closely, commented on his choices, and didn't flatter him. After one rehearsal, she reportedly asked, "Why do you lean on charm there instead of letting the silence work?" Newman was struck not by the question itself, but by the fact that she asked it without hesitation. Unlike others, she wasn't impressed by the myth forming around him. She was interested in the work. Newman later recalled thinking, almost defensively, that she made him feel exposed, and that feeling lingered. At the time, Newman was still married, and he would later acknowledge that this chapter of his life involved mistakes and guilt. But it was also the moment he began to sense that admiration and connection were not the same thing. Joanne didn't orbit him. She stood her ground. Their conversations stretched beyond acting into discipline, responsibility, and personal honesty. And Newman found himself listening more than speaking. He once admitted that Joanne made him uncomfortable in the best possible way, because she noticed when he avoided difficult truths. That realization quietly shifted his understanding of partnership. He had spent years learning from men how to project strength, and from women how to receive admiration. But with Joanne, he was learning how to remain present without performing. That lesson would take years to fully form, but its foundation was laid here, in conversations that felt ordinary at the time, yet would later shape every decision. Before the sentence about hamburgers and steak ever left Paul Newman's mouth, there was a long stretch of years when temptation felt less like a choice and more like background noise. By the late 1950s, Newman was no longer trying to be noticed. He was trying to understand what the attention meant. Film sets became places where admiration was constant, but intimacy was fleeting. And Newman noticed something unsettling about himself. The more people desired him, the less certain he felt about who he was when no one was watching. He once admitted in a later interview, "You start believing the version of yourself people clap for, and that's dangerous." Around this time, Newman worked with both male and female co-stars who reflected different versions of the man he could become. On set with male actors, conversations often revolved around freedom, excess, and the privileges of stardom. One colleague joked during a late-night drink, "You don't stay faithful in this business, you just get better at hiding it." And Newman laughed along, but the comment stayed with him longer than he expected. With female co-stars, the dynamic was different. Some flirted openly, others admired from a distance, and a few treated him as an equal rather than a prize. Newman later said the most dangerous relationships weren't the dramatic ones, but the casual ones, the moments where affection required no commitment. Those are the ones that make you forget the cost, he reflected. His marriage at the time was quietly deteriorating, not from cruelty, but from absence, and Newman would later acknowledge that he handled that chapter imperfectly, avoiding confrontation while drifting emotionally. It was during this emotional drift that Joanne Woodward remained a constant presence, not as an escape, but as a mirror. When they worked together again, their conversations deepened. Joanne was not impressed by stories of parties or conquests. Instead, she asked questions that unsettled him. After one long day on set, Newman reportedly vented about the pressure of being wanted everywhere he went, and Joanne responded calmly, "Being desired isn't the same as being chosen." That sentence landed hard. Newman later said it was one of the first times he realized how much he confused attention with value. Their relationship developed slowly, not because of hesitation, but because both understood the weight of commitment. Newman once confessed to a friend that Joanne frightened him because she would see through the version of himself he used to survive Hollywood. "She won't let me be lazy about who I am," he said. By the early 1960s, Newman had left his first marriage, a decision he later described as painful and necessary, and married Joanne Woodward in 1958. Even then, the story did not suddenly become simple. Fame intensified. Offers multiplied. The same industry that celebrated loyalty in interviews quietly rewarded excess behind closed doors. Newman admitted years later that he was not perfect, that he made mistakes, and that fidelity for him was not effortless virtue, but conscious restraint. What changed, however, was perspective. Joanne was not naive about temptation. She understood the environment they lived in, but she also understood Newman's need for grounding. At home, conversations were ordinary, sometimes even dull, and Newman came to realize that boredom was not a failure of love, but a sign of stability. "The work exhausts you," he once said, And then you come home, and there's normal life waiting. During one particularly exhausting production, Newman returned home visibly drained and joked half-seriously about the absurdity of constant desire. Joanne listened and then said simply, "You don't have to keep proving anything here." That reassurance became a turning point. It reframed fidelity not as denial, but as relief. Newman began to see that attraction outside the marriage often came from admiration of an image, while love at home came from knowledge of the man behind it. The famous sentence emerged not as a public declaration, but as a private philosophy. According to friends, Newman said it casually one evening when someone teased him about Hollywood temptations. "Why go out for hamburgers," he said with a shrug, "when you have steak at home?" The line wasn't about superiority or judgment. It was about recognition. Steak required patience, care, and appreciation. Hamburgers were quick, convenient, and forgettable. Newman understood both, but he finally knew which one sustained him. Over time, that understanding shaped how he aged in Hollywood. He drank too much at times, argued fiercely with Joanne, and questioned himself often. But he stopped confusing desire with fulfillment. In later years, Newman admitted that marriage didn't eliminate temptation. It clarified priorities. "You don't stop noticing," he said. "You just stop pretending it means something." That honesty became the foundation of their partnership. Joanne once summarized their dynamic bluntly, saying, "We fight, we forgive, we stay." For Newman, staying became the quiet rebellion in an industry built on leaving. And as his career matured, he no longer chased the reflection others saw in him. He began to value the version of himself that came home, tired, imperfect, and understood. As Paul Newman grew older, the noise around him slowly faded. Not because the world stopped watching, but because he stopped listening as much. By the 1980s and 1990s, fame had lost its intoxicating edge, replaced by something quieter, more demanding: the responsibility of looking back honestly. Newman often said that aging strips away the excuses you use when you're young. You can no longer blame ambition, opportunity, or confusion. What remains is character. In interviews during his later years, Newman spoke less about roles and awards and more about regret, discipline, and gratitude. He admitted openly that he had not been a flawless husband, that the idea of perfect fidelity was a myth he never claimed to embody. "I wasn't a saint," he said plainly. "I was a man trying to grow up in public." What made his reflection compelling was not denial, but accountability. Joanne Woodward stood beside him through these reflections, not as a symbol, but as a presence shaped by decades of shared reality. Their marriage, which lasted 50 years, endured not because temptation disappeared, but because conversation never did. Newman once said that what saved their relationship was not romance, but routine. Mornings that repeated themselves, meals eaten together, arguments resolved slowly, silence shared without fear. As Joanne's health declined later in life due to Alzheimer's disease, Newman's priorities narrowed further. Friends noticed that he turned down projects, limited appearances, and reorganized his life around being home. When asked why he no longer chased roles the way he once did, Newman replied, "The most important role I have now is already cast." That sentence echoed the same philosophy as the steak and hamburger remark, but carried deeper weight. This was no longer about resisting temptation. It was about choosing presence. Newman became more reflective about masculinity as well. He questioned the Hollywood narrative that equated desire with success. "Men are taught that wanting more means being alive," he said. "But sometimes wanting less is how you survive." Looking back, Newman understood that his early life had been shaped by observation, watching others define strength through conquest, dominance, and freedom. What he learned instead, slowly and imperfectly, was that restraint could be a form of power, that staying could be braver than leaving. The famous quote, often repeated as a punchline, was never meant to shame or simplify. It was Newman's shorthand for a deeper truth, that intimacy built over time carries a flavor no instant pleasure can replicate. Steak isn't exciting every day. It requires patience, care, and appreciation, but it sustains. In his final years, Newman spoke less and listened more. Those close to him said he became gentler, less ironic, more present. He spent time cooking, supporting charitable causes, and sitting quietly with Joanne. When he passed away on September 26, 2008, at the age of 83, the world remembered the blue eyes, the charisma, the legend. But those who truly understood him remembered something else. A man who learned, slowly and publicly, that love is not the absence of temptation, but the decision to return home anyway. Paul Newman's life reminds us that fame amplifies who you already are. It doesn't save you from yourself. His story is not about moral perfection, but about conscious choice. About recognizing that attention fades, desire shifts, and what remains is the life you built when no one was applauding. So when we hear that line, "Why go out for hamburgers when you have steak at home?" we should hear it not as arrogance, but as experience speaking softly. A man who tasted everything the world offered and learned. Sometimes the richest meal is the one waiting for you at the same table, every night, imperfect but real. This video is our way of remembering Paul Newman, not just as an actor, but as a man who wrestled with himself and chose to stay. Thank you for watching until the end. If you enjoyed this story, please like, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment sharing your thoughts about Paul Newman and what his words mean to you today.